The cold desert stretched endlessly, a sea of sand and ice. The wind howled like a predator, carrying with it the bitter sting of the harsh, unforgiving cold. The planet Vrelka, once a bustling hub of alien life and power, was now nothing but a barren wasteland. Few dared to survive in its extreme conditions, but for the alien king, Talaris, there was no other place that would serve his needs. Queen Ceres lay on the ground, her body bruised and broken, the deep cuts on her skin still fresh from the attack. The assassination attempt had been swift and brutal, a plot orchestrated by a rival faction that sought to overthrow the monarchy. The attackers had struck her down and left her to die, but Talaris had always been known for his cold, calculating nature. He didn't mourn her wounds. He only saw her as a weakness. To him, Ceres had become nothing more than a liability, a political burden. The harsh winds picked up, howling across the desert like a relentless scream. Ceres' breath came in shallow gasps. She barely had the strength to lift her head. The royal guards, once loyal to her, had abandoned her at the king's command. It had been clear from the start. Talaris had never truly cared for her. She was only a means to an end. Now, alone and in excruciating pain, Ceres realized the truth. The man she had once loved, her husband, her king, had turned his back on her in her moment of need. She had been cast aside like a discarded object. Her wounds were bleeding heavily, her body growing colder by the minute, and her strength was fading. Yet as she lay there, weakened and betrayed, she couldn't help but reflect on the years she had spent beside Talaris. They had once been partners in power, bound by a shared vision of ruling their empire. But those dreams had shattered long ago. And now she was just another casualty of his ruthless ambition. Her vision blurred as her consciousness began to slip away. The cold was all-consuming, and she could feel her body growing numb. She had lost track of time. Hours, maybe even days, since she had been left to die here, in the heart of this desolate desert. The sound of footsteps interrupted the silence. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks on her, but then she heard it again, a steady, rhythmic crunch against the icy sand. She could barely move, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was coming. Her eyes, barely open, focused on a figure through the haze of her fading consciousness. It was a human, a man, standing tall and strong against the backdrop of the desert storm. She couldn't understand why or how a human would be on Vrelka, let alone in this forsaken place. Humans were not native to the planet, and their kind had always been seen as primitive, unremarkable by the advanced civilizations of the galaxy. But here he was, his face covered by a scarf to protect against the cold. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Ceres saw something unexpected: compassion. It was a strange, unfamiliar emotion that felt foreign in her world of politics and betrayal. She tried to speak, but her voice was too weak to be heard. The human moved closer, crouching down beside her. His hands were warm, gentle as they brushed the sand from her face. "You're alive," he muttered, almost to himself. "I didn't think anyone could survive out here." Ceres wanted to ask who he was, why he was here, but the words never came. She felt herself slipping further, her mind becoming foggy. But before she could fade into unconsciousness, the human spoke again, his voice strong and steady. "Don't worry. I'm not going to leave you here." For the first time in what felt like forever, Ceres felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. But who was this human? And what did he want with her? This is the beginning of the story, where we see Ceres' pain and betrayal, and the first interaction with the mysterious human rescuer. Let me know if you'd like any adjustment. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the icy desert. The sky was filled with swirling clouds, and the temperature dropped rapidly as the night approached. Ceres shivered, the cold seeping deep into her bones. Despite Eric's efforts to keep her warm with his jacket, she could feel her strength waning again. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so vulnerable, so utterly helpless. She had always been a queen, a powerful figure, respected and feared by many. Now she was just a wounded woman, dependent on a stranger. Eric, however, seemed determined to help her. After they had shared the small amount of water he had left, he quickly began to gather supplies from his pack. He had no idea how long they would be stranded, but he knew they couldn't stay out in the open desert for long. The wind was picking up, and the storm that had been brewing in the distance was getting closer. "We need to find shelter," Eric said, his voice low but firm. "The storm's going to hit soon." Cirrus nodded weakly, grateful that he had a plan. Though her mind was foggy, she trusted him. She had no other choice but to trust him. She had been abandoned by everyone she knew, but Eric had not only helped her survive so far, he was also working tirelessly to get them to safety. She didn't understand why. He was just a human, a species she had once viewed as beneath her. But now, she realized how wrong she had been. Humans, like Eric, were capable of great things. The two of them moved across the frozen sand, Eric supporting Cirrus with his arm around her shoulders. The pain in her legs was sharp, but she pushed through it, focusing on the faint hope that they would find shelter soon. After what felt like an eternity of walking, they spotted a large rock formation in the distance. It was not much, but it offered some cover from the wind, and that was all they needed for now. As they approached the rocks, Eric noticed the marks on Cirrus' skin, the deep cuts from her injuries. He hadn't fully realized the extent of her wounds until now, and the sight made his stomach twist with guilt. He had only known her for a short time, yet the thought of losing her to the harsh desert made him feel like he had already failed her. "Sit down," Eric said gently, helping Cirrus lower herself onto a flat rock. "I'll set up a fire." Cirrus sank down onto the rock gratefully. The cold was unbearable, but she knew Eric was doing his best to keep her safe. Her body ached, her mind still clouded by the pain and exhaustion. She tried to focus on her surroundings, taking in the stark beauty of the desert around them. The dark sky stretched endlessly above, the stars twinkling faintly in the distance. It was a reminder of how far away she was from the life she had once known, from her palace, her power, and her people. Eric worked quickly, using a small flare gun to ignite a fire in the small pit he had dug. The flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow against the dark desert night. He knelt beside Cirrus, his expression serious but kind. "We'll stay here for the night," he said. "Tomorrow we can figure out what to do next. I'll get you the help you need." Cirrus looked at him, her heart heavy with gratitude. She hadn't known how much she had needed someone to care for her until now. In the past, her position as queen had always meant that others cared for her. Servants, guards, even Talorus in his own way. But none of them had truly seen her. They had only seen her as a tool, an object to be used for their own gain. But Eric was different. He didn't see her as a queen or a powerful alien leader. He saw her as a person in need, someone worth helping, no matter the risk. The realization made Cirrus' heart ache. She had been so blinded by her power and pride that she had never truly understood what it meant to be cared for by someone without expectation. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to close her eyes and rest. The warmth of the fire, the sound of the wind outside, and Eric's steady presence made her feel, for a brief moment, like she was safe. The desert, with all its dangers, no longer felt quite as empty. But even as she drifted into sleep, a nagging thought lingered in the back of her mind. What would happen when they reached civilization? What would Eric think of her then, once he knew the full truth of who she was? Would he still care for her, or would she become just another enemy in his eyes? For now, she didn't have the answers. But for the first time in days, she didn't feel completely alone. This part delves deeper into Cirrus' feelings of vulnerability and gratitude, as well as her growing trust in Eric. It also begins to build a sense of uncertainty about what lies ahead. Let me know if you'd like any changes or adjustments. The human's touch was the first warmth Cirrus had felt in what seemed like forever. Her body was still weak from the wounds, but the sound of his voice, steady and reassuring, brought her a sense of calm that she hadn't known in days. She barely had the strength to open her eyes, but she could hear him moving around, gathering supplies, trying to help her. The wind still howled in the distance, and the icy desert seemed to press in on her from all sides. When Ceres first found herself alone, abandoned by Talaris, it felt like the end. She had never imagined her life would come to this, lying broken and discarded in a cold desert, with no one to save her. Her only hope had been that the storm would take her swiftly, ending the suffering. But now, this human had appeared, offering something she hadn't felt in years: kindness. The human knelt down beside her, his movements careful and precise. His face was covered by a scarf to shield him from the desert's freezing winds, but his eyes were clear and focused as they met hers. There was no fear in his gaze, only an unexpected concern. It confused Ceres, and for a moment, she wondered if this was some kind of trick. Why would a human, someone from another world, care about the queen of an alien empire? "Hold on," he said softly, reaching for a small pack he carried. "I've got some supplies here." Ceres couldn't speak. Her body was too weak, and the pain was still too intense. She had been alone for so long that she almost forgot how to trust anyone. Her life had been filled with lies, manipulation, and betrayal. The only ones who ever seemed to care for her were those who wanted something in return. Talaris had been no different. She had been nothing more than a pawn in his games of power. But this human, he didn't seem to want anything from her. He didn't ask for anything. He just helped. He carefully poured a small amount of water into her mouth, his hands gentle as he helped her drink. The cold liquid burned in her throat, but it felt good, refreshing, almost life-giving. She coughed slightly, her chest rattling with the effort, but she drank it all, desperate for more. It had been too long since she had tasted water, and now, the strength it gave her was almost enough to lift her spirits. "Who are you?" Ceres managed to croak, her voice weak, but growing stronger with each word. The human smiled softly, adjusting the scarf around his face. "The name's Eric. I'm stranded here, same as you." Ceres blinked, still trying to process the strange reality of her situation. A human, on Vrelka. It didn't make sense. The last time she'd heard anything about Earth or its people, they were considered primitive by the standards of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. How could someone like him survive in this unforgiving place? Eric seemed to sense her confusion, and he gave a small shrug. "I was exploring the planet when my ship broke down. No way to call for help." His gaze softened. "I didn't expect to find anyone out here. Least of all, you." Ceres wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but her body wouldn't allow it. Every movement took so much energy, and her mind was foggy from the blood loss and exhaustion. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather her strength. Eric's hand rested gently on her shoulder, and though he didn't say anything, Ceres felt a sense of calm wash over her. She hadn't known peace in a long time. Certainly not since the moment Talaris had betrayed her. "Listen, I'm not sure how I can get you out of here, but I'll do what I can," Eric continued. "We'll find shelter, get you to safety. You're not alone anymore." The words, though simple, felt like a promise. And in that moment, Ceres knew that she had to trust him. There was no other choice. She had nothing left but this strange human and the faint hope he offered. The journey ahead would be difficult. Her wounds were severe and the desert was relentless. But for the first time in days, she felt the flicker of something she thought was lost forever: hope. This part focuses on Ceres' growing trust in Eric and her struggle to survive, as well as the first steps they take together toward shelter. Would you like to continue or make any changes? The fire crackled softly, its warm glow lighting up the dark desert night. The wind howled outside the small rock shelter, but inside, Ceres and Eric were shielded from the worst of the storm. The warmth of the fire was a welcome relief for Ceres, though it did little to ease the pain in her body. She still couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that gnawed at her heart. Talaris's face, once so familiar and full of love, was now nothing more than a memory of broken promises. As she sat by the fire, Cirrus couldn't help but wonder about Eric. Who was he, really? Why had he chosen to help her? He was a stranger, someone from a faraway world, yet here he was, risking his life to save her. She had never known anyone who would do such a thing. It was both humbling and confusing. Humans were not known for their kindness in the galaxy. In fact, they were often dismissed as weak and primitive by the more powerful alien races. Yet Eric's actions seemed to prove otherwise. Eric noticed Cirrus staring into the fire, her face pale and drawn. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of everything she had been through. He didn't fully understand the political games she had played in her past life, nor the reasons behind her betrayal by Talaris. But he knew one thing: she was still a person, a living being who deserved compassion. "Cirrus," he said softly, breaking the silence, "I know you're in pain, but we need to talk. We can't stay here forever. The storm might pass, but we'll need to figure out where to go next." Cirrus blinked, slowly coming back to the present moment. She hadn't realized how much her mind had wandered. "I know," she said quietly. I don't know what to do anymore. My world is falling apart. The man I loved, my own husband, left me to die. I have nothing left." Eric's face softened, his expression full of empathy. "I can't pretend to understand what you're going through, but I do know what it's like to be alone. When I crashed here, I thought I'd never make it out. But now I have a reason to keep going, to help you." Cirrus looked at him, her heart heavy. She didn't know how much longer she could keep up this fragile facade of strength. She had always been a queen, always in control of her destiny. But now she felt lost. Lost in the desert, lost in her own emotions, and lost in the aftermath of betrayal. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean on someone else, even if just for a moment. "I don't know why you're helping me," she admitted, "but I'm grateful. I don't know what I would have done without you." Eric gave her a small smile. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together now. Whatever happens next, we'll face it as a team." Cirrus stared into the fire, her thoughts racing. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, least of all someone she had just met. She had always been in control. Her decisions had shaped the galaxy, and her power had commanded respect. But now she had no power, no throne, no army to protect her. All she had was this human, a stranger in a strange land. And yet, for some reason, that was enough. "Tomorrow," Eric continued, "we'll need to find shelter and maybe some way to contact my people. I don't know if anyone's looking for me yet, but I won't leave you here alone. If we're going to survive, we need a plan." Cirrus nodded, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know where to go from here," she said softly. "I thought I had everything figured out. I was a queen. I had power. But now, I'm nothing." Eric shook his head. "You're not nothing. You're someone who's been through hell and come out the other side. That's not nothing. And no matter what, you still have a chance to start over. Maybe it's not the life you thought you'd have, but you're still here. That's what matters." Cirrus met his gaze, the warmth in his eyes giving her a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know where their journey would take them, or what the future held. But for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope, hope that maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her life from the ashes of her past. As the night stretched on, and the storm continued to rage outside, Cirrus and Eric sat together by the fire, silently acknowledging the fragile alliance they had formed. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, they felt a shared purpose, a purpose that would guide them through whatever dangers lay ahead. This part explores the emotional connection between Eric and Cirrus as they start to rely on each other and begin to make plans for the future. It touches on their growing trust and the idea that they are now in this together, despite the odds. Let me know if you'd like to make any adjustments. The first rays of the morning sun broke through the heavy clouds, casting a pale light over the desert. The storm had passed, but the wind still howled in the distance, a constant reminder of how unforgiving this planet could be. Saris woke to the sound of crackling firewood and the warmth of the flames that had kept them alive through the night. Eric was already awake, packing up their small camp with quiet efficiency. His movements were precise, as though he had done this many times before. Despite the danger they were in, he seemed calm, focused. Saris couldn't help but admire his determination. He had risked everything to help her, a queen without a throne, stranded on a cold desert planet. And yet, there was no hesitation in his actions. "Good morning," Eric said as he noticed Saris stir. He smiled lightly, though his eyes held a trace of concern. "I've packed what we need. We should leave before the winds pick up again." Saris nodded, slowly sitting up. Her body was still sore from her injuries, but she was beginning to feel a little stronger. The rest she had gotten, though brief, had helped her recover some energy. Still, she knew the journey ahead would be difficult. They needed to find shelter, and more importantly, they needed to find a way off this planet. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice hoarse from the dry air. "For everything." Eric didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and offered his hand to help her to her feet. She hesitated for a moment before accepting. She wasn't used to relying on others, but in this moment there was no choice. She needed his help, and he had already proven himself to be trustworthy. "We'll get through this," Eric said, his tone steady. "But we have to keep moving. The desert isn't forgiving. We need to stay ahead of the storm and find shelter before nightfall." Saris glanced around. The endless expanse of sand and rock stretched out before them, the horizon barely visible through the dust. It was hard to believe that there was any life in such a harsh environment. Yet she knew Eric wouldn't lead her into danger without a reason. He had already shown that he was resourceful, and now she had to trust him. They started walking, their pace slow but steady. Saris leaned on Eric for support as they moved across the rocky terrain. Despite the cold, the air felt alive, full of the energy of the storm that had passed. It was a strange feeling, one that made Saris uneasy. She had never been so vulnerable, so reliant on someone else for survival. Her life had been one of power and control, until now. As they moved deeper into the desert, the landscape began to change. The rocks grew larger, and the sand gave way to jagged cliffs and narrow canyons. It wasn't much, but it offered a sense of shelter from the wind, and that was enough. Eric had set his sights on a distant mountain range, hoping to find some form of civilization there, or at least a place to rest for the night. But even as they moved forward, Saris couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. There was an unease in the air, a tension she couldn't explain. Her instincts, honed by years of ruling an empire, told her that they were being watched. Eric seemed unaware of the growing sense of danger, his focus fixed on the path ahead. But Saris kept glancing over her shoulder, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling with every step. "Eric," she said, her voice low, "do you feel that? Like we're being followed?" He paused, looking around. The desert seemed empty, silent. The only sound was the wind and their footsteps in the sand. "I don't see anyone," he said, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice. "It's possible we're just being paranoid. The desert plays tricks on you sometimes." But Saris couldn't shake the feeling. There was something about the way the wind moved, the way the shadows shifted. It wasn't natural. She had faced many threats in her life, and her instincts had always served her well. And right now, they were screaming at her. "We need to keep moving," Saris said, her voice urgent. "Someone's out there." Eric hesitated, but then nodded. "All right, we stick together. If anyone's following us, we'll deal with it." The two of them quickened their pace, their eyes constantly scanning the desert around them. The air seemed to grow heavier, the silence more oppressive. And yet, despite their best efforts, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As they neared the base of the mountains, the ground suddenly trembled beneath their feet. It was subtle at first, but then the tremor grew stronger, and the sound of rumbling filled the air. Saris froze, her heart pounding. She could feel the vibrations in the ground, a warning of something big approaching. "Eric," she gasped, her voice tight with fear. "We need to move. Now." The creature's glowing eyes locked onto Cirrus and Eric, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the growl that rumbled from deep within the creature's chest. It was massive, its body covered in thick, jagged scales that gleamed in the pale sunlight. Each step it took sent tremors through the ground, and Cirrus could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on them. Eric instinctively stepped in front of Cirrus, his body tense and ready for action. He had no weapons, nothing but his wits and the will to survive. But he wasn't about to let this creature take her, no matter what. "Stay behind me," he whispered urgently, his voice low but steady. Cirrus didn't argue. She knew the danger they were in. She had faced countless battles. But this was different. This was not some political opponent she could outwit. This was a creature born of the harsh desert, built to survive in ways she couldn't comprehend. And it was hunting them. The creature's growl deepened, and it took a slow step toward them. Its massive claws scraped against the rocks, sending a shower of debris flying. Its tail flicked behind it like a whip, its sharp spikes glinting in the light. It was clearly not just an animal. It was a predator. And they were its prey. "We need a plan," Eric muttered under his breath. "Do you have any weapons?" Cirrus shook her head. Her blaster had been damaged when she had crashed, and her combat skills were still hindered by her injuries. She was vulnerable, and it frustrated her. She wasn't used to feeling this helpless, and it made the situation even more dangerous. The creature took another step forward, its eyes never leaving them. Eric slowly reached into his pack, pulling out a flare gun. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing he had that could possibly buy them some time. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm as he aimed the flare gun at the creature. Before he could fire, the beast lunged, its powerful limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. Eric barely had time to react. He fired the flare gun into the air, and the bright red streak shot across the sky. But it wasn't enough to stop the creature's attack. It barreled toward them, its jaws wide open, ready to strike. Cirrus didn't hesitate. Her body reacted on instinct, and she grabbed Eric's arm, pulling him toward a large rock nearby. The creature's jaws snapped shut just inches from them, missing by mere seconds. The force of the creature's movement sent a shockwave through the ground, nearly knocking them both off balance. "We need to get to higher ground," Cirrus said, her voice strained. "It can't follow us if we can get up the rocks." Eric nodded quickly, not needing any further explanation. They both scrambled up the jagged rocks, the creature's eyes following them as it prowled below. The climb was difficult, and Cirrus felt her strength beginning to fade. But there was no choice. They couldn't stop now. They reached a narrow ledge near the top of the rock formation, and Cirrus collapsed against the stone, panting. Her body was still weak, but she knew they had only moments before the creature would find a way to follow them. Eric crouched next to her, his breath heavy as he scanned the landscape. "We can't stay here long. It'll find a way up." Cirrus nodded, her mind racing. The creature had already proven how quickly it could adapt. They needed to find a more secure position, something that could give them the upper hand. But as she looked out over the desert, a thought crossed her mind. The creature wasn't the only danger they faced. There were others who had been hunting her long before this creature appeared. Talaris had enemies, and those enemies were just as dangerous as the beast below. "They'll come for me," Cirrus whispered, her voice barely audible. "Even if we escape this creature, the others will find us. They won't stop until they have me." Eric turned to her, his expression serious. "We'll deal with that when the time comes. Right now, we have to survive. We'll figure out the rest later." Cirrus looked at him, seeing the resolve in his eyes. For a moment, she almost believed him. Maybe they could survive this, together. The thought was foreign to her, but in the face of this new threat, she couldn't deny that Eric had become more than just an ally. He was a lifeline. But just as she began to feel a flicker of hope, the creature below them gave a terrifying roar. It was circling the base of the rocks, trying to find a way up. Its eyes were locked onto them, filled with hunger. "We don't have much time," Eric said, standing up and scanning the area. "We need to move." Cirrus nodded, pushing herself to her feet despite the pain. They had no choice but to keep going. There was only one thing they could do now: outsmart the beast and find a way to survive long enough to escape this desert. If they could do that, maybe they had a chance. The creature's growls echoed through the canyon, a reminder that they had no time to waste. Its massive form was still circling the base of the rocks, its eyes locked onto Cirrus and Eric. It was only a matter of time before it figured out a way up. Eric's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was racing, thinking of a way out. The ledge they were on wasn't large, and there were no obvious paths for escape. The rocks above them were too steep to climb, and if they tried to descend to the ground, the creature would be waiting. "We need to get to higher ground," Eric muttered, scanning their surroundings. "There's a ridge up ahead. It's our only chance." Cirrus looked up, her eyes narrowing. The ridge Eric was talking about was at least 100 feet away, and the ground between them and safety was open and exposed. They would have to cross the rocky desert with the creature hot on their heels. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only plan they had. "I can't run that far," Cirrus said, her voice strained. "I'm still too weak. The pain." "We don't have a choice," Eric interrupted, his voice firm. "I'll help you." We moved together, quickly. Cirrus nodded, but fear tightened in her chest. She had been in dangerous situations before, but never like this. This creature was relentless, and the harsh desert gave them no mercy. She was no longer the queen of a vast empire. She was a fugitive, relying on a human to survive. Without another word, Eric helped Cirrus to her feet. She winced, the pain in her side flaring up, but she refused to let it stop her. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. "Follow me," Eric said, taking the lead. They started moving quickly across the rocky terrain, their footsteps sure but rushed. The wind still howled around them, carrying the dust of the desert, making it difficult to see clearly. But Eric's focus was unwavering, his eyes locked on the ridge ahead. Cirrus kept pace with him, forcing herself to ignore the pain in her body. She could hear the creature's growls growing louder as it continued to circle the rocks below. It wasn't giving up. It was waiting for them to make a mistake. They reached a narrow path that led up toward the ridge, a series of jagged rocks and tight spaces. The climb was difficult, and Cirrus stumbled more than once, her strength failing her. But Eric was there, steadying her each time she faltered. "You're doing great," Eric said quietly, his voice full of encouragement. "Just a little further." Cirrus didn't answer. She was too focused on putting one foot in front of the other. She had always been a fighter, and she wasn't about to let this creature, or anyone, take her down. Not now. As they neared the ridge, the creature's growls grew even louder, as if it was aware they were close to safety. Cirrus could feel the creature's presence, a heavy weight pressing on her chest. It was closing in. "Almost there," Eric said, urging her on. With a final push, they made it to the top of the ridge. Cirrus gasped for breath, her legs trembling from the climb. She collapsed onto the ground, her body exhausted, but she knew they couldn't stop yet. The creature was still out there. Eric looked around, searching for a place to hide. The ridge stretched out before them, narrow and winding, with steep drops on either side. There were a few rocky outcrops that could provide some cover, but they needed to move quickly. The creature was relentless, and they couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. "We need to find a shelter," Eric said, scanning the horizon. "Somewhere the creature can't reach us." Cirrus nodded, her breath shallow. "I know. I don't want to stay here, but I don't think I can run anymore." Eric's face softened. "You don't have to. We'll find shelter, and then we'll figure out what to do next. I promise." Just as Eric spoke, A loud roar filled the air, shaking the ground beneath them. The creature had found the ridge. It was climbing, using its claws to dig into the rocks, determined to reach them. "There's no time," Saris said urgently, pushing herself to her feet again. "We need to move. Now." They ran, as fast as they could, toward a narrow crevice in the rocks that offered some cover. The creature's growls followed them, its heavy footsteps growing closer with each passing second. The crevice was small, just wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it was their only hope. They reached it just as the creature lunged, its claws scraping against the rocks. Saris barely made it through in time, her body scraping against the sharp edges of the stone. But she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Eric was right behind her, pulling her through the narrow opening and into the darkness beyond. They had made it into the crevice, but the creature was still close. They could hear its heavy breathing, its growls vibrating through the rocks. The crevice was narrow, but it provided the briefest moment of shelter. The harsh winds outside were muffled, and for the first time in hours, Saris and Eric could catch their breath. They leaned against the cool, jagged rock walls, listening as the creature's growls echoed faintly from the distance. Saris closed her eyes, feeling the tremors of her body slow. She could still hear the sounds of the desert, the faint rustle of sand shifting in the wind, the distant calls of creatures unknown. But inside this small refuge, it felt almost peaceful. Almost. "We need to figure out what to do next," Eric said, his voice low but steady. He was sitting against the wall opposite Saris, his eyes scanning the shadows around them. "We can't stay here forever." Saris nodded, grateful for the silence, but she knew they had no time to waste. The creature wouldn't stop. If anything, it would only become more determined to find them. And there was no guarantee that the shelter they had found would keep them safe for long. "We can't stay in the open," she said softly. "But there has to be a way off this desert. I can't stay here." Eric looked at her, his gaze serious but not judgmental. "I understand. I'll help you find a way. We just need a plan." Saris thought for a moment. They had no supplies, no vehicle, and no clear direction. Her injuries were slowing her down, and the desert was vast and unforgiving. But she couldn't let herself think like that. She had been a ruler, and rulers didn't give up. Not even when all seemed lost. "Do you know of any settlements around here?" she asked, her voice steady, but a hint of desperation creeping in. "Somewhere we can find help." Eric hesitated before shaking his head. "Not exactly. I've heard rumors of a few outposts further south, but they're few and far between. And with the creature still after us, it's going to be hard to get anywhere safely." Saris sighed. She was used to having answers, to knowing how to get out of impossible situations. But now she was at the mercy of the desert, and her survival depended entirely on Eric's knowledge of this planet. "There must be something," she muttered. "Something to turn the odds in our favor." Eric's eyes shifted to the narrow passageway behind them. "We'll figure it out. But for now, we need to rest. We can't think clearly if we're exhausted." Saris wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was starting to catch up with her. The constant tension, the pain in her side, and the fear of what might come next had worn her down more than she realized. She leaned back against the rock wall, closing her eyes for a moment. Despite the fear and uncertainty, she found herself oddly comforted by Eric's presence. He was a stranger, but he had become her protector, her guide in this vast, dangerous world. She had never needed anyone before, but now she did. "Eric," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "What's your story? I know almost nothing about you. Why are you helping me?" Eric paused, his eyes thoughtful. "It's not as complicated as you think," he said, his voice quiet. "I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't have any loyalty to your empire, but when I saw you, hurt and alone, I couldn't just leave you there. You needed help, and I guess I'm just trying to do what's right." Saris regarded him silently, His words were simple, but there was sincerity in them. She had ruled over millions, seen countless faces in the crowds, but never had someone offered help so selflessly. It was strange, humbling even, and it made her question her own beliefs. "Thank you," she said after a pause, her voice soft but full of meaning. "For everything." Eric gave a small smile. "Don't mention it. I don't want to see anyone out here alone, especially not someone like you." Cirrus raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me? What does that mean?" He shrugged, his smile not fading. "You're strong. I can see it. Even now, you're not giving up. You're still looking for a way out. I admire that." Cirrus felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. She wasn't used to receiving compliments, especially from someone who had no reason to care about her. But in this moment, in the quiet of the desert, she allowed herself to feel a little less like a queen and a little more like a person. A person who had been shown kindness, even in the most unlikely of places. "I suppose I owe you more than I can repay," she said quietly. "We'll figure it out," Eric replied, his voice reassuring. "But for now, let's rest. Tomorrow, we move." Cirrus nodded, grateful for the calm before the storm. They had a long road ahead of them, and the danger wasn't over yet. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a small sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore. They would face the desert together. As the hours passed, they both sat in silence, the desert outside still and quiet. The creature had disappeared for now, but Cirrus knew it would return. The desert was silent, the winds no longer howling. The heat of the sun had faded, and the stars began to twinkle above them, distant and cold. Cirrus and Eric had spent the night in the narrow crevice, resting as best they could. But now, with the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, the reality of their situation set in. They couldn't stay here forever. Eric was the first to stir, standing up and stretching his stiff limbs. "We need to move," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Cirrus nodded, pushing herself to her feet. The night had done little to ease the pain in her side, but she refused to show weakness. She had always been strong. She couldn't stop now. Eric helped her up, offering a hand to steady her. "Take it slow," he advised. "We don't know what's out there, but we can't afford to push you too hard." "I'll be fine," Cirrus said, her voice determined. She glanced at the ridge ahead, the same place they had been aiming for yesterday. "We just need to get there." They set off together, moving carefully across the rocky desert. The heat of the day was starting to rise, making the air shimmer in the distance. The creature's growls were gone, but Cirrus knew that didn't mean they were safe. It could be anywhere, waiting, watching. As they moved further, they came across a small ravine, the rocks narrowing into a tight passage. The way forward was blocked by a large boulder, but there was a narrow gap just big enough for them to squeeze through. "This is it," Eric said, glancing at Cirrus. "We get through this, and we should be clear." Cirrus nodded, her pulse quickening. She could feel the tension in her muscles, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her survival, and for the chance to reclaim what had been taken from her. "I'll go first," Eric said, carefully stepping through the gap. He turned to help Cirrus once he was on the other side. But just as he reached out to grab her hand, a loud roar echoed across the desert. The creature was back. They had no time to waste. "Move," Eric shouted, pulling Cirrus through the gap and into the ravine. The ground beneath them shook as the creature's massive form appeared at the top of the rocks, its glowing eyes fixed on them. They ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. The ravine was narrow, but it provided some cover. The creature couldn't move through the tight passage, but it was relentless, sending rocks tumbling down in an attempt to trap them. The sound of its claws scraping against the stone echoed, the creature closing in. Cirrus's breath was labored, but she pushed herself forward, refusing to slow down. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. As they neared the end of the ravine, Eric spotted a narrow ledge above them, leading up to a higher plateau. "We can climb up there," he shouted. "It's our only chance." Cirrus barely hesitated. She knew what had to be done. She grabbed onto the rocks, pulling herself up as best she could, her hands slick with sweat. The pain in her side flared, but she gritted her teeth and kept climbing. Eric was right behind her, his strong arms reaching up to help her when she faltered. Together, they reached the top, just as the creature lunged toward them. Its claws scraped against the rocks, but it couldn't reach them. Breathless and exhausted, they crouched on the plateau, peering over the edge. The creature was still below them, roaring in frustration, but it couldn't climb up to where they were. "We made it," Cirrus said softly, her voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She looked at Eric, her heart still racing. "We're not out of danger yet, but we're safe for now." Eric nodded, but his eyes were still sharp. "We've survived this long, and we'll keep surviving. We'll find a way out of this desert together." Cirrus looked out across the vast expanse of the desert. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the crash, she felt a small spark of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. And with Eric by her side, maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim her destiny. "We're not finished yet," she said, her voice strong. "We'll get through this, and we'll make sure it counts." Eric gave her a reassuring smile. "I believe that." As the creature roared below, Cirrus and Eric sat side by side, watching as the first rays of the sun touched the horizon. The desert was still harsh, the dangers still real, but together, they had made it this far. And together, they would face whatever came next. This final part provides the resolution, showing Cirrus and Eric's determination and the bond they formed. They'd faced immense challenges, but the story ends on a hopeful note, with the promise of more challenges to come. Let me know if you need anything else or any adjustments. The desert was silent, the winds no longer howling. The heat of the sun had faded, and the stars began to twinkle above them, distant and cold. Cirrus and Eric had spent the night in the narrow crevice, resting as best they could. But now, with the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, the reality of their situation set in. They couldn't stay here forever. Eric was the first to stir, standing up and stretching his stiff limbs. "We need to move," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Cirrus nodded, pushing herself to her feet. The night had done little to ease the pain in her side, but she refused to show weakness. She had always been strong. She couldn't stop now. Eric helped her up, offering a hand to steady her. "Take it slow," he advised. "We don't know what's out there, but we can't afford to push you too hard." "I'll be fine," Cirrus said, her voice determined. She glanced at the ridge ahead, the same place they had been aiming for yesterday. "We just need to get there." They set off together, moving carefully across the rocky desert. The heat of the day was starting to rise, making the air shimmer in the distance. The creature's growls were gone, but Cirrus knew that didn't mean they were safe. It could be anywhere, waiting, watching. As they moved further, they came across a small ravine, the rocks narrowing into a tight passage. The way forward was blocked by a large boulder, but there was a narrow gap just big enough for them to squeeze through. "This is it," Eric said, glancing at Cirrus. "We get through this, and we should be clear." Cirrus nodded, her pulse quickening. She could feel the tension in her muscles, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her survival, and for the chance to reclaim what had been taken from her. "I'll go first," Eric said, carefully stepping through the gap. He turned to help Cirrus once he was on the other side. But just as he reached out to grab her hand, a loud roar echoed across the desert. The creature was back. They had no time to waste. "Move," Eric shouted, pulling Cirrus through the gap and into the ravine. The ground beneath them shook as the creature's massive form appeared at the top of the rocks, its glowing eyes fixed on them. They ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. The ravine was narrow, but it provided some cover. The creature couldn't move through the tight passage, but it was relentless, sending rocks tumbling down in an attempt to trap them. The sound of its claws scraping against the stone echoed, the creature closing in. Cirrus's breath was labored, but she pushed herself forward, refusing to slow down. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. As they neared the end of the ravine, Eric spotted a narrow ledge above them, leading up to a higher plateau. "We can climb up there," he shouted. "It's our only chance." Cirrus barely hesitated. She knew what had to be done. She grabbed onto the rocks, pulling herself up as best she could, her hands slick with sweat. The pain in her side flared, but she gritted her teeth and kept climbing. Eric was right behind her, his strong arms reaching up to help her when she faltered. Together, they reached the top, just as the creature lunged toward them. Its claws scraped against the rocks, but it couldn't reach them. Breathless and exhausted, they crouched on the plateau, peering over the edge. The creature was still below them, roaring in frustration, but it couldn't climb up to where they were. "We made it," Cirrus said softly, her voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She looked at Eric, her heart still racing. "We're not out of danger yet, but we're safe for now." Eric nodded, but his eyes were still sharp. "We've survived this long, and we'll keep surviving. We'll find a way out of this desert together." Cirrus looked out across the vast expanse of the desert. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the crash, she felt a small spark of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. And with Eric by her side, maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim her destiny. "We're not finished yet," she said, her voice strong. "We'll get through this, and we'll make sure it counts." Eric gave her a reassuring smile. "I believe that." As the creature roared below, Cirrus and Eric sat side by side, watching as the first rays of the sun touched the horizon. The desert was still harsh, the danger still real, but together, they had made it this far. And together, they would face whatever came next. This final part provides the resolution, showing Cirrus and Eric's determination and the bond they'd formed. They'd faced immense challenges, but the story ends on a hopeful note, with the promise of more challenges to come. Let me know if you need anything else or any adjustments.